Wow, why it can happen here. Paul Krugman is, he's broadly speaking, he's a progressive, he's a liberal, he's a good guy, he's an economist, he's, won the Nobel Prize, I believe. He's solid, but he's also, he's a New York Times columnist and in a very real way, one of the voices of the establishment. And when the establishment starts talking about the United States going fascist, literally losing democracy, I start really paying close attention. Up until maybe the last 3 or 4 months, it had been largely just voices like mine. People who are not the establishment, as it were. We're part of the mainstream media, arguably. We're on commercial stations all over the country. We're also on nonprofit stations and free speech TV and Pacifica stations and whatnot. But, talk radio, I guess, in general. The same thing is true of Limbaugh and the guys on the right. That, they're not considered the establishment, the official voices of the media. But Paul Krugman is. He's one of the official voices out there. And his op-ed in today's New York Times, why it can happen here. He starts out talking about Poland and Hungary. These are both countries that are members of the EU. They're members of the European Union, but they no longer are democratic, small d democratic. The Law and Justice Party in Poland and Fidesz in Hungary, which I believe means fidelity, I could be wrong. Krugman notes, have maintained the forms of popular elections, but have destroyed the independence of the judiciary, suppressed freedom of the press, institutionalized large-scale corruption, and effectively delegitimized dissent. And the result of this is one-party rule for the foreseeable future, he writes. And then he goes on to say the Republican Party in America is eager to become an American version of Law and Justice, the Polish party, or Fidesz, the Hungarian party. And then he gives examples. In North Carolina, when a Democrat won the governorship, the Republicans in the state legislature passed legislation stripping the governor of his power. In Georgia, they used these, to quote Paul Krugman, transparently phony concerns about access for disabled voters to close most of the polling places in a mainly black district. In West Virginia, the Republicans took over the legislature and they impeached the entire Supreme Court. This was last week, and replaced it with Republican hacks. And he says, on a smaller scale in towns and counties and state houses across the country, you're seeing the exact same kind of story. He says, in fact, the modern GOP feels no allegiance to democratic ideals. It will do whatever it thinks it can get away with to entrench its power. He describes this, in his words, as, quote, really scary. And then he goes on to say, if Republicans retain control of both houses of Congress in November, which, by the way, is entirely possible, the Koch brothers' hundreds of millions of dollars have yet to drop into the election cycle in a big way. If Republicans retain control of both houses of Congress in November, Krugman writes, we will become another Poland or Hungary faster than you can imagine. And the disease that has fed this in Poland and Hungary and here in the United States, he says, is, quote, white nationalism run wild. So here we have all the makings of an autocracy. And one of the first things that an autocrat has to do, the first thing that an autocrat has to do, a dictator, a wannabe dictator, the first thing they have to do is destroy the press. They have to control the narrative. If they can't control the narrative, they can't control politics and they can't control the country. And when they are governing based on fear and on lies, they have to control the narrative. So what's the first thing Donald Trump does this morning? He wakes up and, freaks out, basically, apparently because Lou Dobbs, who Donald Trump watches religiously, did a segment on this last night on Fox News and then this morning tweeted about it. Lou Dobbs retweeted a piece just before Donald Trump went nuts from PJ Media, basically making the claim that if you Google Donald Trump news, 96% of what you get is from left-leaning media. Left-leaning media like CNN. right? Or MSNBC. You know, meet the press, meet the Republicans. I mean, you know, there's more Republicans on these networks than there are Democrats, and they almost never have genuine progressives on, but they constantly have hardcore right-wingers like Bill Kristol on. Bill Kristol, the guy who convinced John McCain to pick Sarah Palin. Bill Kristol, the guy who wants to privatize Social Security, who wants to end Medicare, but he smiles nicely on TV. So here, Donald Trump. Google search results for Trump news show only the rigged only the View reporting of fake new, he means news, media. In other words, they have it rigged, in all caps, for me and others, so that almost all stories and news is bad. I think when you have plural, it should be R, but anyway. Fake CNN is prominent. Republican, conservative, and fair media is shut out. Illegal? 96% of results on Trump news are from the national left-wing media. Very dangerous. This is how dictatorship happens. Now, Google comes out and says, we don't have a political bias. We just run a search engine. But it doesn't matter what Google says. This is the process of destroying America's trust in news, in the actual information. And we're already seeing it. I mean, Trump has admitted to crimes that would have gotten Barack Obama or Bill Clinton or Jimmy Carter impeached like that. So I refer you to Milton Mayer's book back in the late 1940s. Milton Mayer, a reporter with the Chicago Sun, went over to Germany after their defeat in World War II and spent a year there and lived with and got to know 10 average Germans. One was a baker, one was a bricklayer, one was a college professor, one owned a small store, as I recall. And he wrote their stories. In this book, they thought they were free. And one of these guys who came to be his friends told him this story. This was the college professor. He says, this separation of government from people, this widening of the gap, took place so gradually and so insensibly, each step disguised, perhaps not even intentionally, as a temporary emergency measure, or associated with true patriotic allegiance or real social purpose. And all the crises and reforms, and there were real reforms too, so occupied the people that they did not see the slow motion underneath of the whole process of government growing remoter and remoter. To live in this process is absolutely not to be able to notice it. Please try to believe me, unless one has a much greater degree of political awareness, acuity than most of us ever had the occasion to develop. Each step was so small, so inconsequential, so well explained, or on occasion regretted, that unless one were detached from the whole process from the beginning, unless one understood what the whole thing was in principle, what all these little measures that no patriotic German could resent must someday lead to, one no more saw it developing from day to day than a farmer in his field sees the corn growing. And then one day, it is over his head. He goes on to say, you see, one doesn't see exactly where or how to move. Believe me, this is true. Each act, each occasion is worse than the last, but only a little worse. You wait for the next and the next. You wait for that one great shocking occasion, thinking that others, when such a shock comes, will join with you in resisting somehow. You don't want to act or even to talk alone. You don't want to go out of your way to make trouble. Why not? Well, you know the habit of doing it. And it's not just fear of standing alone that restrains you. It's also genuine uncertainty. Uncertainty is a very important factor, and instead of decreasing as time goes on, it grows. Outside in the streets, in the general community, everyone seems happy. One hears no protest, certainly sees none. You know, in Italy or France, there's slogans against the government, but in Germany, there's not even this. And that one great shocking occasion, when tens or hundreds of thousands will join you, never comes. That's the difficulty. If the last and worst act of the whole regime had come immediately after the first and the smallest, thousands, yes, millions would have been sufficiently shocked if, let us say, the gassing of the Jews in 43 had come immediately after the German firm stickers in the windows of non-Jewish shops in 33. But of course, this isn't the way it happens. In between come all the hundreds of little steps, some of them imperceptible, each of them preparing you not to be shocked by the next step. Step C is not so much worse than step B, and you didn't make a stand at B, so why should you make a stand at step C? And so on to step D. And one day, too late, your principles, if you were ever sensible of them, all rush in upon you. The burden of self-deception has grown too heavy. And some minor incident, in my case, my little boy, hardly more than a baby, saying Jews, swine, collapses it all at once. And you see that everything has changed, and changed completely under your nose. You know, I wonder how many parents whose kids have gone off and joined these white supremacist movements are having the same kind of moment. This, oh my God, what happened? Back to the college professor in Germany, he writes, he says, the world you live in, your nation, your people, is not the world you were in at all. The forms are all there, all untouched, all reassuring, the houses, the shops, the jobs, the mealtimes, the visits, the concerts, the cinema, the holidays. But the spirit, which you never noticed because you made the lifelong mistake of identifying it with the forms, the spirit has changed. And now you live in a world of hate and fear. And the people who hate and fear don't even know it themselves. When everyone is transformed, no one is transformed. Now you live in a system which rules without even responsibility to God. And here we are. I mean, we are not obviously where Germany was in 1943, but I think we are certainly where Germany was in 1933. And it gets even bigger and scarier when you consider that all it takes to flip things like this is a crisis. And after the break, I want to tell you about what that crisis might be. And it's a BFD, to paraphrase Joe Biden. It's a big deal.